Plato is a man with some really good one-liners. I mean, this guy has said some gold in his day. Things like, "Your silence gives consent," or "The penalty good men pay for indifference is to be ruled by evil men." He also came to the big brain conclusion that man can best be defined as a featherless biped. But for all the wisdom of one of the most central figures in philosophy, he also owned slaves. Today, when we discuss ancient figures like Plato, Aristotle, or even more recent figures like the Founding Fathers, there tends to be an understanding that we can't judge those past figures based on the morality that we have today. The general understanding seems to be that while slavery is wrong, those men didn't have the same moral system, so we can't judge them according to ours. This mindset seems to be pretty broadly accepted, but I can't help but ask why. If that's how we view morality, then virtually at any point in history can we justify just about any atrocity. Let's take the Mongol Empire, for example. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire was believed to be responsible for around 11% of the world's current population at their time. There are between an estimated 37 and 60 million deaths directly linked to the Mongols' invasions. Yet the Mongol Empire was the largest empire that has ever existed. You could make the argument that while genocide and rape are really bad, they were also just kind of a part of the culture at the time. See how loose this argument is? Obviously, this type of logic isn't going to sit well with most of us. So, what even is morality? And is there any kind of constants that we can use to help us throughout time in order to determine what right and wrong is? Let's find out in this week's episode of UnExamined. You're going to edit that out, right? So, to start out, it would probably be useful to tackle exactly what morality is. Unfortunately, morality isn't one of those things that you can just look up the definition and get a definitive answer on what it is. For example, the Oxford definition of morality is principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, kind of depends on when you examine some things. Like, who gets to set these principles? What is good or bad, right or wrong? After all, if you were to ask a deer, the deer would tell you that a lion who chases them is evil. But to the lion, it's probably more evil that the deer runs from them. Both the lion and the deer are just trying to survive using their own best understanding. So clearly our morality depends on perspective. With an estimated 100 billion humans living throughout human history, finding a single perspective that can unite all of our differing beliefs and views on morality is going to be a bit tricky. So, a religious person might tell you that their religion provides the basis for their morality. But when you zoom out to include all of humanity, this becomes a bit tricky. There are roughly 4,200 different recorded religions, denominations, sects, and beliefs. And many of the thousands of different religions and beliefs are actually variations of the same belief system that have radically different views on how that belief system should work, based on different interpretations of their holy texts. But even if we were to wipe all that aside and say, all right, let's just pretend that this specific religion has the key, and it knows exactly where morality comes from, we're faced with a bit of a dilemma. You see, it's extremely hard to define where morality comes from within a religion. Let's take the Abrahamic faiths, for example. The Bible, the Tanakh, and the Quran would all tell you that morality comes from God. It's given to us. But how did God get these morals? Plato himself asked a similar question, which has come to be known as the Euthyphro dilemma. So, the question goes sort of like this. Is that which is morally good, good because God demands it? Or does God demand it because it is good? Now, this argument has stumped theologians and philosophers for years. Let's break this question down piece by piece to get at the root of what Plato is trying to ask. Is that which is morally good, good because God commands it? This implies that morality can only exist as what God, or the gods, in Plato's case, says and feels is right. Now, there would be no universal constants under this type of belief. This has some rather disturbing implications, however, because what this could mean is that whoever the God is that is making these rules, morality is only based on their whims. If God were to come up to you on the street and tell you to go into town and kill 5 strangers, that would be the morally correct thing to do, and you would be obliged to do it because that's what God said, and he's always moral. And even if you don't think your particular God would do this, by subscribing to the belief, you must admit that an all-powerful God can, or else they're not all-powerful. So, what's the other alternative? If God commands something only because it is good, that means that there is a form of morality that exists higher than God himself, and God is essentially just acting as a middleman. Now, this mental exercise isn't meant to imply that your personal beliefs or the deity of your choosing are invalid. It's merely meant to demonstrate that when dealing with morality, religion doesn't give us any easy answers. And all of this is without even deciding which of the 4,000 previous mentioned different religions and denominations to choose from. All right, so maybe we can't really easily decide with religion, but what does that mean for us? Does morality exist outside of our mind? Is there any form of constant empirical evidence of morality? Or is it all just subjective? Well, yes and no. Philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche would tell you that morality only exists within the society that creates it, while others, like Immanuel Kant, would say that there is a universal constant that we should follow. For Kant, for example, he believed that whatever you should do it in accordance that it would always be okay for everyone to do it ever. Seems pretty straightforward. But what does that mean when a murderer comes to your house and asks to find your brother? Well, you would be morally obliged to tell him he's in the back, because it would be wrong for you to lie in other circumstances. It would be wrong for other people to lie at any other given point. Therefore, it's always wrong to lie. Now, that's a bit of a hard moral system, and there's many other complex moral systems created by philosophy that can help us decide what we think morality is. But the long story short, no matter which way you look at it, morality is complicated, and there is simply no one bulletproof answer as to how we should use it. So, I guess Plato's safe, and we have no moral basis on how to judge someone for something like owning slaves. Episode over. We're done here. Roll credits, guys. But wait! There's more! You didn't think I was gonna make this easy, did you? Ladies and gentlemen, I am here today to tell you that there is indeed a single metric for which we can judge almost all of human history against. I hope that doesn't look as cringy as it felt. So, for the purposes of the rest of this video, let's assume that morality is subjective. Now, the purpose of assuming this isn't to dictate that morality is subjective and that that's all it's ever been and that that's the correct way of thinking, but simply to point out that even if all our morality is based on is the abstract thinking of whatever society happens to view as relevant at the time, there is still clear-cut metrics throughout all of human history that we can use to justify an action. To put it simply, I've got one rule. The golden rule, to be precise. If you're like me, when you hear the golden rule, you're instantly teleported back into grade school where your Sunday school instructor was telling you, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You might even assume that that phrase is actually Christian or Abrahamic in origin, but that's where you'd be wrong. The golden rule has appeared in some variation or another in almost every single religion or ethical tradition throughout history. Even in creeds that seem to abstain from a belief in a creator seem to follow this basic moral concept. The oldest record of this type of mindset can be dated all the way back to the ancient Egypt era in a parable about the goddess Maat. Do to the doer to make him do. While this version of the phrase clearly isn't as elegantly phrased as some of its later iterations, it's pretty understandable since this particular parable that it comes from is nearly 4,000 years old. Just to give that some perspective, recorded human history only goes back about 5,000 years. This makes this particular phrase older than Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, and even likely older than Judaism itself. In all cultures, this phrase seems to fall into one of three categories. 1. Do what you want done to yourself, a positive connotation. Don't do what you wouldn't want done to yourself, a negative connotation. Wish upon others what you would wish for yourself, an empathetic connotation. The single goal of this moral idea is to create a world where everyone treats each other with the same kindness that we would want for themselves. In Christianity, we see this pop up as love your neighbor as you love yourself. Judaism teaches basically the same while also saying what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. In Islam, the Hadith records Muhammad teaching that which you would want for yourself, seek for mankind. And for Buddhism, this is essentially the cornerstone of the belief, with Siddhartha Gautama, Buddha, teaching that putting oneself in the place of another, one should not kill nor cause another to kill. And frequently use the mantra, just as I am, so are they. You could even say that the phrase itself was one of the building blocks for Western philosophy itself, with Thales widely regarded as one of the first philosophers, predating both Plato and Socrates, saying, avoid doing what you would blame others for doing. And this was nearly 200 years before Plato ever decided to pretend that he was Socrates. There are literally dozens more examples that I could source from almost every recorded doctrine throughout history, but I think we've made our point. Throughout nearly all of recorded history, humans have been guided by one constant moral principle. Unfortunately, we seem to be really bad at following it. Okay, so the Founding Fathers were undeniably bastards, right? You didn't seriously think I was going to go a whole episode without talking about US politics, did you? You sweet summer child. But seriously, it should be pretty clear at this point that regardless of how you tried to defend them, the men in power, whether it's colonial America or all the way back to antiquity, were morally bankrupt and completely hypocritical. Still not convinced? Okay, let's streamline the argument. It would seem that we have two ways of looking at morality. Either A, morality is based on the rules of society, or B, morality is rigid and consistent, given to us by some form of God. If morality is actually based on something outside of society, if it was given to us by some form of a universal creator, then it stands to reason that that morality would have to be rigid and constant, unchanging, Kantian even, meaning no matter what, right is right and wrong is wrong. If that's the case and slavery is wrong, then it was always wrong, and there was never a single point in history where you could judge it any other kind of way. Period. If slavery is wrong today, then it was wrong then, because that is the logic. That means that any Confederate Civil War soldier, any colonial founder, any philosopher from antiquity who owned slaves was indisputably immoral. However, if you believe that morality was created by the societies that uphold them, then you also run into a problem. You see, up till now, I've been very deliberate with my framing and how I wanted to consider the morality of these men. I wanted to examine these men on their own merits and according to their own systems. But why is it that whenever we ask these questions, nobody ever considers the morality of the slaves and their views on slavery? Plato owned 5 slaves. So that's 5 slaves to 1 master. So within the society of his household, that is a 5-to-1 ratio of people who have a genuine interest in not being slaves versus the one who has an interest in owning slaves. Plato, therefore, would be judged immoral strictly on that alone if it's based on society, and that's without even considering the hypocrisy based in his own moral views. George Washington owned 317. 124, but the rest of them he worked on his property and were managed directly by him, but were owned by other people. Look, I don't want to belabor the point in a drawn-out video, but how much of our society needs to be against something in order for it to be qualified as immoral? During the founding of the U.S., slave population was nearly a third of the entire country, with slaves making up half of the entire population of the southern states. According to some statistics I found here, in the year 1990, only a few years after the U.S. founding, there was 1,240,000 free white people in the South, while there was over 650,000 slaves. This means that slaves represented approximately 1/3 of the population. This ratio stayed about the same for the next 70 years, while the populations increased, with the population of enslaved people growing to just shy of 4 million by 1860. I wasn't able to find any exact data on how many slave owners there were exactly at the founding of the US, but with the population of enslaved people growing at consistently the same rate as the population of free white people in the South, I'm going to assume that the population of slave owners increased at roughly the same rate as well. By 1860, there was about 394,000 slave owners in the South. The total population of the South during this time was roughly 12.25 million, which means that only 3% of the entire population was slave owners. This is yet another example of a small percentage of the wealthy upper class using their power to manipulate and extort people at the bottom solely for profit. You have 3% of the population enslaving and abusing about 33% of the population. And somehow, the only defense that people can muster today is, well, it was a different time. Society was different then. Or, these men helped shape the country. We should show them respect. No. That's simply not good enough. These men knew good and well that slavery was immoral. There were active debates at the founding on whether or not slavery should be abolished, but they didn't. There is simply no moral excuse for men who participated in owning slaves. Even those who openly protested the legalization of slaves continued to own slaves themselves, such as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. No matter which way you slice it, the men in power throughout history that owned slaves were bastards. And it's long past time we stopped worshiping them like they were some form of American gods. I suspect that the reason a great many people defend the founders is for the same reason that I used to. I grew up in a strict Southern conservative upbringing, and I too used to adamantly defend the founders, even Confederate leaders. Why did I defend them? Was it because I didn't think they were bad people? No, I think I defended them because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I was put in their same position of power, that I would have done the exact same thing. And recognizing that ugliness inside of yourself, recognizing that all of us are capable of that kind of evil, isn't something we're comfortable with. If you're born into privilege, it's hard to turn away from it. But that's not an excuse. That doesn't justify it. This leads me to my final point on morality. And that's the idea of choice. I plan on doing a deep dive fairly soon on the concept of free will. But for now, let's just summarize by saying that there's an argument to be made that none of us, not me, not you, not Plato or the founders, truly have free will. And if that's the case, these people can't be held responsible for the decisions they made. But even if that's true, and we don't express free will, and all of our decisions are just the result of causality, we are still agents of our own decisions. We are still the agents of our own causality, which means that if one of us goes on to murder someone, that murderer should still be held responsible, regardless of how much choice we think they had on the matter. In recent years, anytime the US government tries to implement a system that would aid people who have historically been oppressed, libertarians and conservatives alike tend to say something along the lines of, well, that's not what the founding fathers had in mind when they wrote the Constitution. But to them, I say, so? Who cares what these men did or didn't want? The world has advanced and changed in literally billions of ways that these men could never have thought of. These were men who chose to enrich themselves in a practice that they knew was unethical, in a practice that they knew exploited those in need, and they chose to do it anyways. These are the same men who could say with a straight face, liberty and justice for all, and then turn around and exclude people of color, women, and anyone who was poor, so poor that they couldn't own a house, from being included in that justice for all. Even for all his flaws, Thomas Jefferson recognized this and suggested at one point that the entire Constitution should be rewritten every 19 years. So what? Should we just throw everything out that Plato and the founders ever wrote? No, that's not what I'm saying. Plato gave us a great many sources of wisdom that we still reflect on today. But while I'm not trying to dispose of that wisdom and just throw it out the door, I do want us to reflect on where that wisdom comes from. It comes from a deeply flawed man who's drenched in hypocrisy. And I think it's long past time that we recognize that. We have to be willing to look at these men from history and have an honest conversation about their flaws. Because when we whitewash their sins, we inevitably defend them for the indefensible. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. I'm so sorry that it took me so long to get a new video out. It has been a crazy few months for me, but I've got some help now and I'm going to start working on videos as much as I possibly can. I'm not going to give any kind of promises on what a regular upload schedule is going to look like, but I am going to try. Couple quick things. Just if you could leave a like and a comment, it really does help with the algorithm, helps to boost the channel. And personally, I actually really enjoy engaging with you guys. So if you comment, I'm probably going to reply, especially if you're trying to have questions or some sort of philosophical discourse. I really enjoy that. Also, if you could share this with anyone you think would enjoy it, it's important to remember these things right around this time of year, that these men weren't perfect and that we should hold their images accountable and not necessarily deify them as these perfect founders that we have. Anyways, that's our video. That's our show. Thank you so much for watching. Be good to yourselves, be good to each other, and as always, don't let your life go unexamined. Look at the Mongols, for example. Under Genghis Khan, we have roughly 4,200 different not this bit.